Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West, Episode 30, Picking Up the Pieces. We left off at the end of 1415, where two events had just shook up the political situation in France: the Battle of Agincourt and the death of Dauphin Louis of Guyenne. Today we'll see how John the Fearless, Henry V, the Armagnacs, and the new Dauphin deal with the fallout of these events. We'll also catch up with an old friend, Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Hungary, and now King of Germany as well. So let's start by getting acquainted with the new Dauphin, John, Duke of Touraine. John of Touraine was born in 1398, making him 17 when he became the Dauphin. I've briefly mentioned him before, as he was married to Jacqueline of Bavaria, daughter of William of Bavaria, Count of Hainault-Holland-Zeeland, and Margaret of Burgundy, as a part of Philip the Bold's plan to intertwine the royal house with his own. Ever since the wedding took place back in 1406, John had been living in Hainault with his wife and in-laws. As William and Margaret had no sons, John and Jacqueline were being groomed to take over the counties of Hainault, Holland, and Zeeland. This of course meant that when John became the Dauphin, he had no experience of Parisian power politics. John of Touraine thus wasn't in Paris when Louis of Guyenne died, and his presence in William of Bavaria's household made the Count of Hainault-Holland-Zeeland a major player in French national politics all of a sudden. If you're wondering why that's the case, just remember the kidnapping of the Dauphin from episode 22, and all the effort that the Armagnacs and Burgundians went to in order to control the person of Louis of Guyenne throughout his life. Now you might think that due to the long-standing relationship between William of Bavaria and John the Fearless, the new Dauphin's position in William's household would be a huge boon to the Duke of Burgundy. Certainly, the Armagnac-dominated royal council thought so, as one of their first goals after the death of Louis of Guyenne was to get the new Dauphin to Paris and away from the influence of his father-in-law as quickly as possible. But William was not willing to be a pawn of his brother-in-law. The partnership between the houses of Burgundy and Bavaria was always built upon mutual interest, and now William of Bavaria did not see his interests best served by simply lining up behind John the Fearless. If his daughter was to become Queen of France, he wanted to reconcile the factions and restore stability to the kingdom. So initially, William of Bavaria set up an independent household for the Dauphin, staffed with neutral officers. He sent a request to both sides to lay down their arms, and he refused John the Fearless's initial offer to march on Paris together and forcefully install the Dauphin with the Burgundian government. However, any further move towards reconciliation was blocked by the irreconcilable Count of Armagnac. With Louis of Guyenne dead, and most of the Armagnac princes killed or captured at Agincourt, the Count of Armagnac was able to seize control of the royal council. As Jonathan Sumption put it, quote, "There was no one to challenge him. The official element on the council was cowed. The Duke of Berry, weary and bowed with age, and with only 6 months to live, was the Count's father-in-law, and depended on him to defend his interests in Languedoc. The Duke of Anjou, affable, ineffectual, and vacillating, was too ill and too frightened of John the Fearless to take an active role, and anyway spent long periods away from Paris. The Queen ostensibly enjoyed extensive powers as regent under the ordinances, but her health was also poor, and with little influence in the council and no popular following outside, she was progressively marginalized. And so Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac and Constable of France, became one of the most powerful men in the kingdom almost overnight. He quickly undid much of Louis of Guyenne's efforts to create a neutral, royal party, and began a purge of royal officers who weren't sufficiently hostile to John the Fearless. As the Duke of Burgundy had always been more popular with the people of Paris than the Armagnacs had been, the Count of Armagnac viewed the populace as a possible fifth column, and began a program of repression in the capital. He replaced the commanders of all garrisons in the city with his men, and stationed companies of his loyal Breton and Gascon soldiers throughout it. Parisians were forbidden to assemble or carry weapons, guards were stationed everywhere, and any suspicious behavior could get you arrested, or worse. The king was moved from the Hôtel Saint-Paul to the more defensible Palais de la Cité, and surrounded by the Count of Armagnac's soldiers, to prevent a mob from reaching him in case a revolt broke out, to prevent a possible Burgundian abduction scheme, and to prevent anyone from trying to convince him that all this repression might not be a great idea. The Duke of Burgundy had lost some of his popularity with the less radical sections of Paris due to his involvement with the Cabochon uprising, but now some of those Parisians began to look back at his tenure as master of Paris more fondly when compared to the Count of Armagnac's heavy-handed rule. John was eager to take advantage of all of this discontent in Paris, and by extension maybe showed that the Count of Armagnac's oppression was effective even if it was unpopular. Burgundian agents soon launched a conspiracy to summon an angry mob to seize Paris and kidnap or kill several leading members of the Armagnac administration. As this was happening, more agents would force open one of the gates of the city where a company of Burgundian soldiers would be waiting. The soldiers would join up with the mob and secure control of the city. The Duke of Burgundy gave his blessing to the plot and even sent some of his officers to coordinate with the plotters. But word of this conspiracy got to the lover of one of the targets of assassination, and she advised him to flee Paris at once. On his way out of town, he tipped off the authorities that something was afoot, and before long, the conspiracy was discovered. The Count of Armagnac redoubled his campaign of repression, and was able to send soldiers throughout the city to round up the conspirators, and heads began to roll. But this did not make him any more popular with the people of Paris, and plots to return the city to the Duke of Burgundy would continue throughout the Count of Armagnac's tenure as master of Paris. But as all this was going on, and really for the past few years, the tension between England, France, and Burgundy was also playing out in the German city of Constance. But before we can really dig into the Council of Constance, I want to go back and cover what's been going on in the Holy Roman Empire for the past decade and a half. We last left the empire back in 1400 with the deposition of Wenceslaus of Luxembourg and the elevation of Rupert of Wittelsbach. Now you might remember that I mentioned at the very beginning of this episode that Sigismund of Luxembourg was now king of Germany, so neither of those two. Up until 1407, Wenceslaus had been allied to the Orleanist faction, but upon Louis's death he began to court the Burgundians. In 1407, when Rupert was threatening to recover Brabant from Anthony of Burgundy for the empire, Wenceslaus confirmed Anthony's possession of the duchy. Furthermore, in 1409, he married his niece, Elizabeth of Görlitz, to Anthony, whose first wife had died 2 years earlier, and handed the Duchy of Luxembourg to him as well. Although Anthony's tenure in Luxembourg was marked with significant resistance to Burgundian rule. The Luxembourger King of Germany also helped John with his attempts to gain control over the city of Besançon, which was an imperial free city despite being right in the center of the county of Burgundy. And so Rupert, who had been initially, if only marginally, supported by Philip the Good, turned against the Burgundians and worked to expel them from the empire. But at the end of the day, neither Rupert nor Wenceslaus were strong enough to mount effective opposition to Burgundian encroachment, nor were they strong enough to force each other from the throne. The conflict over the throne of Germany was further complicated by the Council of Pisa. The council, which convened in 1409 in the city of Pisa for the purpose of resolving the Western Schism, ended up being opposed by Rupert but accepted by Wenceslaus. The Council of Pisa included a selection of cardinals from both Rome and Avignon, and voted to depose both popes and elect a new one. However, neither established pope accepted his deposition, and so for a few years there would be 3 rival popes rather than 2. But despite his opposition to its outcome, the Council of Pisa didn't prove to be a thorn in Rupert's side for long, as he died in 1410. However, Rupert's death did not usher back the triumphant return of Wenceslaus, as very few in the empire wanted him back, although it was a boon to the wider House of Luxembourg. After Rupert's death, both Sigismund of Luxembourg, Wenceslaus's half-brother, and Jost of Luxembourg, their cousin, arranged to get elected King of Germany. And as Wenceslaus was still calling himself King of Germany, there were briefly 3 kings of Germany, one for each pope. But Jascht died in 1411, and soon after, Sigismund was able to force his half-brother to give up his claim to Germany in exchange for not challenging his hold on the crown of Bohemia. So now we're down to one king of Germany, but we still have 3 popes. But before Sigismund and the Pisan Pope call the Council of Constance to deal with that situation, I want to explore Sigismund's relationship with Burgundy. Sigismund had inherited Rupert's view of Burgundy rather than Wenceslas's. Obviously, there was no love lost between the comrades of Nicopolis. He viewed the encroachment of Philip the Bold's sons into the empire as a major threat, and in particular was hostile towards Anthony, who had done most of the encroaching. Like Rupert, Sigismund refused to recognize Anthony as Duke of Brabant, and especially resented Anthony's claim on his dynasty's home duchy of Luxembourg. So after John the Fearless was ousted from Paris after the Cabochon uprising, Sigismund entered into an alliance with the Armagnacs. The King of Germany even tried to reconcile England and Armagnac France to form a grand alliance with the ultimate goal of partitioning the Burgundian lands. So now let's travel to Constance for the opening of the council in 1414. The council was organized into 5 nations, being England, France, Germany, Spain, and Italy. The German nation included all of the non-Germans to the east of the empire, such as Poles, Czechs, and Hungarians, among many others, but was shockingly not the most divided, as that honor went to the French nation. Not only did the Armagnac government send a delegation, but so did the University of Paris and John the Fearless. The main source of conflict between the French delegations was the fate of Jean Petit's justification of the Duke of Burgundy. The University of Paris had already declared the justification heretical, but now it was up to the Council of Constance to formally decide the matter. The campaign against the justification was led by Jean Gerson, a doctor of theology at the University of Paris, who had previously benefited from the patronage of Philip the Bold, but who had suffered at the hands of the Cabochon. The debate on the justification lasted almost a year, and in the end, the wider council decided to neither condemn nor approve it. Probably a wise move for a council built upon reconciliation. But in the main, the debate over the justification was a relatively minor sideshow when compared with the goal of ending the schism, which had now been going on for almost 40 years. One major hurdle in ending the schism was the hostility between England and France, so in 1415, Sigismund decided to visit both London and Paris with the aim of reconciling the kingdoms. But Sigismund didn't reach France until the beginning of 1416, and by then, the English victories at Harfleur and Agincourt had complicated the situation. Sigismund's efforts to make peace between England and France threw a bit of a wrench in the plans of both Henry V and the Count of Armagnac. Henry was eager to capitalize on the momentum that Agincourt had given him, while Bernard VII was eager to reverse the English king's gains. The constable's primary aim after Agincourt was the reconquest of Harfleur, and when Sigismund first arrived in Paris, the French siege of the city was about to begin. Meanwhile, Henry V had heeded Sigismund's peace envoys and had agreed to delay his subsequent invasion of France. Sigismund's time in Paris was mutually antagonistic. The Count of Armagnac had no interest in peace with England at the moment, but he also wasn't in the capital at the time. This proved to be both good and bad. Good, because it meant that no clash between Bernard and Sigismund would occur. The two were both known to have fairly unpleasant personalities, after all. But bad, because it meant that no one in Paris could actually guarantee that a peace agreement made would be abided by. And because, as these peace talks were going on, the leader of the French government was currently attacking English holdings. The King of Germany soon became frustrated with his lack of progress, but he also offended many members of the French court. Part of this was due to a culture clash, and part of it came from the fact that Sigismund had become convinced that a rapprochement was needed with the Duke of Burgundy. But it also seemed that many of the French princes resented Sigismund's haughty opinion of himself and his office. An amusing anecdote comes from a time when Sigismund attended a meeting of the Parlement of Paris. He was present where a lawsuit was brought forward where 2 men claimed that they had both received the same royal office. And it's possible that they both were granted this office due to the many and confused appointments made over the past few years. One plaintiff was able to prove that only a knight could hold the office, and that as the other wasn't a knight, it should go to him. Sigismund then asked the other plaintiff if he wished to become a knight, and then knighted him right then and there. The judges then confirmed the office on the newly minted knight. However, once Charles VI heard of this suit, he became furious, as it seemed to him that Sigismund was trying to assert the prestige of the empire over that of France. So annoyed with the French court, and convinced that peace required taking France down another peg, Sigismund decided to quit France for England a few weeks after he had arrived. Sigismund got on much better with Henry V than he did with the French court, so much so that before long he had shifted his goal from trying to make peace between England and France to trying to help England decisively win the 100 Years' War. While Sigismund and Henry V were in negotiations for an alliance, John the Fearless was also in talks with the English. At this point, John's main fear was that the English and the Armagnacs would enter into an alliance, and if they did, there was little that John could do to resist a combined Anglo-Armagnac army. But fortunately for the Duke of Burgundy, the Count of Armagnac was as unwilling to compromise with English demands as he was with Burgundian ones. So while the Duke of Burgundy was still unwilling to enter into a formal alliance with the English, the previous treaties of Flemish neutrality were expanded to include all of John's lands. In exchange for the Duke of Burgundy staying neutral in any subsequent English invasion of France and preventing his subjects from rallying to the French army, Henry V would stay out of John's territories. This agreement brought Burgundy and England closer together and established their common enemy as Armagnac France. While this agreement was no military alliance, both parties did find that splitting the attention of the Count of Armagnac was mutually beneficial, as neither the Burgundian forays into Picardy nor the English defense of Harfleur would have to face the full force of the Armagnac French army. So with Sigismund and John the Fearless both cozying up to Henry V, Sigismund decided to put his old hatreds aside and try to come to an agreement with the Duke of Burgundy. This was made easier with the death of Anthony of Burgundy in Agincourt. Now, Brabant was being ruled by a child and regency council, and Luxembourg had reverted back to the House of Luxembourg. While Sigismund still resented French encroachment into his empire, no longer was the House of Burgundy the foremost example of it. He now focused on weakening the French crown in order to regain influence over the empire's western regions as a whole. The King of Germany was still wary of further Burgundian expansion into the empire, but he was at least willing to put those concerns aside for the purpose of reducing the wider French encroachment. So at the beginning of September 1416, Sigismund and Henry V were in Calais in order to resume negotiations with both the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. Like the other recent rounds of Anglo-Armagnac negotiations, these got nowhere, and so when John the Fearless arrived in Calais the next month, he found Henry and Sigismund frustrated and angry with the Armagnacs. But while John's talks with Henry and Sigismund seem to have been much more amicable than any of their talks with the Armagnacs, not much came from the Calais conference. John was able to exploit Henry's influence over Sigismund to get the King of Germany to recognize his claims on the County of Burgundy and the parts of Flanders in the Empire, but apart from that, no formal alliance was made here either. The fact of the matter seems to be that both sides felt that the threat of an alliance to the Armagnacs was a more useful bargaining chip than an actual alliance would be, at least at the moment. Anyways, the current arrangement was already beneficial, and a formal alliance would complicate the situation and leave less room for either side to maneuver, both militarily and diplomatically. Furthermore, John still had his reputation in France to think about, and a formal English alliance would have torpedoed his popularity with the people. The Calais conference broke up with assurances of friendship between the participants, but without any offensive plans made. Jonathan Sumption does claim that a measure of, quote, strategic cooperation was likely established at Calais, and we'll see how that goes in the next episode. But that would be as far as any Anglo-Burgundian agreement ever went during John's lifetime. So with the Calais conference now over, John's attention returned to Paris, and he still saw his nephew-in-law, the Dauphin, as his ticket back into power in the capital. By the time that the Calais talks had ended in late October 1416, John of Touraine had been Dauphin for almost a year and had still not gone to Paris, instead remaining in his father-in-law's county of Hainault. The Armagnacs in charge of the government were eager to both secure the person of the Dauphin and to make sure that the only person they secured was the Dauphin. The Armagnacs knew that the Duke of Burgundy intended on riding back to power on the coattails of the Dauphin, and they had no intention of allowing that to happen. Fortunately for them, William of Bavaria also had no intention of allowing that to happen. As John was preparing for the Calais conference, he had spent some time in Hainault trying to convince William of Bavaria to hand John of Touraine over to his custody and to attend the Calais conference. But the Bavarian responded to his brother-in-law in no uncertain terms that he planned on remaining the guardian of the Dauphin. William also declined to show up at Calais. He had been in his own negotiations with the English on France's behalf, but when these came to nothing, he decided that a stronger stance against England than what John the Fearless was pursuing was necessary. In late 1416, William of Bavaria was determined to continue his earlier strategy of attempting reconciliation, much to the annoyance of both parties. But William was able to reach agreements with both the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. With the Armagnacs, he agreed that it was time for Dauphin John to return to Paris to preside, if only nominally, over the royal council. With the Duke of Burgundy, he agreed that once he and the Dauphin were back in Paris, that John the Fearless would be invited back to reconcile with the king, and that William would not allow the Dauphin to fall under the sway of the Armagnacs. However, the Armagnacs had not agreed to William's deal with John the Fearless, but that bridge would have to be crossed once Dauphin John was in Paris. As the threat of another English invasion loomed on the horizon, the Dauphin and William proclaimed that as the Peace of Arras was technically still in effect, all civil strife should be put aside to fend off the English. The Dauphin would lead a French army, rather than a Burgundian or an Armagnac army, in defense of the kingdom, and urged partisans from both sides to flock to his banner. Queen Isabeau was William of Bavaria's main partner in preparing Paris for the Dauphin's arrival. She had always held herself somewhat aloof from the Armagnacs, and there was no love lost between Isabeau of Bavaria and Bernard of Armagnac. So when the constable established his dominance of the royal council, he worked to marginalize the queen. Isabeau still held formal power from the ordinances of the early 1400s, covered in episode 20, but she had few supporters in the royal council or in Paris as a whole, and so she was sidelined by Bernard of Armagnac. Isabeau was thus a natural partner of William of Bavaria. For one, they were cousins, but they also both had significant motivations to make peace between the factions, put the Dauphin at the head of the government of Paris, and bring the Duke of Burgundy back into the fold. And as the two Bavarians made their plans, they were joined by many of the less strident Armagnacs, who were beginning to tire of the Count of Armagnac's tyrannical tendencies and desired peace and reconciliation. But despite all that I've been saying about how William of Bavaria was staking out a neutral position, and how he did not plan on simply allowing John the Fearless to ride John of Touraine back to power, his journey to Paris did not do much to allay the Armagnac fears that was the case. William and John of Touraine were accompanied to Paris by a small Burgundian army and a corps of Burgundian advisors. This was mostly to secure the physical safety and political independence of the Count of Hainault-Holland-Zeeland and the Dauphin from the Armagnacs, but also to reassure John the Fearless that he was not being abandoned by his brother-in-law. However, this did create additional complications back in Paris. The Dauphin's entourage halted in the Picard city of Saint-Quentin, where they received word from the Armagnacs that they would resist John the Fearless's entry into Paris to the death, and that conviction extended to the Dauphin if he attempted to return to Paris with anyone other than his household officers. Initially, the queen had intended on meeting her son to facilitate his entry into the capital, but she remained in Paris, possibly at the orders of the Count of Armagnac, and possibly because she had some misgivings about the extent of Burgundian influence around the Dauphin. Instead, she sent the Duke of Brittany to negotiate an agreement, as he had maintained a mostly neutral position in the Civil War. So as 1416 turned to 1417, negotiations continued between the Dauphin and Armagnac France. In a somewhat surprising turn of events, the Duke of Brittany's return to Paris from these negotiations coincided with King Charles regaining his faculties. While back in the capital, John of Brittany managed to briefly gain the king's confidence, and for a minute it looked like a reconciliation could be managed under the moderating auspices of the Duke of Brittany. John V brought the Dauphin from Saint-Quentin to the closer city of Compiègne, managed to get the king to appoint John of Touraine his lieutenant general for all of France, and summoned the queen from Paris to Senlis in order to give her some more freedom of action. But when John of Brittany left the Ile-de-France to meet with the Duke of Anjou, the Count of Armagnac once more seized power and ended the negotiations between the Dauphin, the Queen, and Paris. The Count of Armagnac then headed to Compiègne himself with a collection of his most dedicated supporters to try and pry the Dauphin away from William of Bavaria. They still wanted the legitimacy that the Dauphin's person provided, without sharing any of their power with the Bavarians or the Burgundians. As all the talks thus far had gotten nowhere, William of Bavaria then made his way to Paris, and in front of the royal council, proclaimed that the Dauphin would come to Paris with the Duke of Burgundy, or he would go back to Hainault. This firm line was disagreeable with the Count of Armagnac, and so while he claimed he needed some more time to think about William's final offer, he conspired to have the Count of Hainault arrested, possibly to be exchanged for the Dauphin. But William learned of this plot and fled the city early in the morning. Who knows what his next plans for the Dauphin were, because when the Count of Hainault arrived in Compiègne, he found that John of Touraine had come down with a serious illness. A few days later, John, Duke of Touraine, and Dauphin for the past 15 months, died. John of Touraine's death was a disaster for John the Fearless, partly because the new Dauphin, Charles of Ponthieu, was engaged to a daughter of Louis of Anjou, and thus was as closely connected to the Angevins as John of Touraine was to the Bavarians. But mostly because with John of Touraine died the Duke of Burgundy's best chance for a beneficial settlement with the Armagnacs. William of Bavaria, despite not adopting a fully Burgundian position over the past year, had been uncompromising in his moves to restore John the Fearless to Paris. When all was said and done, who knows what a Bavarian brokered settlement would have looked like, but it was certainly better than being out of power for another year. There were rumors that John of Touraine had been poisoned by Armagnac agents for precisely this reason, but the fact of the matter was that he had always had somewhat fragile health, which many of his siblings had shared. As for John of Touraine the man, we've really only just met him, and there's not much that comes down about his personality. He was still young when he died, and unlike his older and younger brothers, he spent comparatively little time in the spotlight. I can't say much more about him other than the fact that he comes across as quite agreeable and concerned for the kingdom of France in the chronicles, which is commendable, I guess, but he did not seem to have an especially strong personality, as he did spend his entire tenure as Dauphin being led around by his father-in-law. He was not as effective a politician as Louis of Guyenne had been, but given time he might have gotten there. But he didn't have that time, and now we have a new Dauphin, who we're going to get fully introduced to next time. Before we go, and while we're in the Memento Mori section of the episode, there are 3 other deaths that I'd like to note. The first of these is John of Berry. The Duke of Berry died back in June of 1416, and while I wanted to bring it up earlier in the episode, there just wasn't a great time to do it. The Duke of Berry has been with us since the beginning of the narrative proper. He was first mentioned way back in episode 6, but I don't think we really got to know him until the death of Philip the Bold. He really did seem to spend much of his life in the shadow of his brothers, first Charles V, then Philip the Bold. But that seems to have been enough for him. In an age where unbridled ambition dominated, the Duke of Berry was one of the few people seemingly happy with what he had. Admittedly, what he had was a gigantic appanage, tons of money, and a significant influence over the government of the kingdom, so it's not like he didn't have a lot. John of Berry spent much of the Civil War trying to act as a peacemaker. He abhorred the murder of his nephew, Louis of Orleans, but practicality seemed to trump principle, and he worked on many occasions to bring the Duke of Burgundy and the more hardcore Armagnacs closer together. But the uncompromising positions of both camps made that task all but impossible, and eventually he fell decisively on the side of the Armagnacs. but I always get the feeling that he was the most amenable to a deal out of all of them. The scene that will always stick in my mind with John of Berry was him looking at his nephew after the siege of Bourges was lifted and tearfully saying, "When your father was living, there was no need for any barriers between us." John of Berry outlived all of his sons, and so his large appanage, the duchies of Berry and Poitou, were passed first to John of Touraine and then Charles of Ponthieu. While John did not have much of an opportunity to make the most of these lands, Charles certainly will. And speaking of Charles of Ponthieu, he was only Dauphin for a few weeks before his father-in-law, Louis II of Anjou, died. Now, Louis of Anjou wasn't around as much as the Duke of Berry was, both temporally and physically in France, as he spent much of his life chasing his father's dream of ruling Naples. In many ways, Louis II was quite similar to his uncle Berry. He initially tried to be a peacemaker between the factions and spent some time in both camps. But in the end, his vacillating between Armagnac and Burgundian began a bitter feud between him and his cousin John the Fearless. Louis had once agreed to marry his oldest son, another Louis, to John's daughter Catherine. But when John fell from power in 1413, Louis repudiated Catherine. John never forgave this insult, and this repudiation provoked a deep rift between the Valois houses of Anjou and Burgundy, one that outlived both John and Louis. I'm not going to devote quite as much time to Louis of Anjou, as I also haven't in the past, but we will be getting to know his formidable widow, Yolande of Aragon, in the coming episodes, as well as his son-in-law, the Dauphin, who will thus not follow in the fate of his late brother-in-law, John of Touraine, being led around by his father-in-law, for better or for worse. Which brings me to the last death to cover in this episode. About 2 months after John of Touraine died, William of Bavaria, Count of Hainault-Holland-Zeeland, and almost father-in-law to the King of France, was bitten by a dog. The bite got infected, and he died. And thank you, Winston, for the sound effect. I'm not going to go into the consequences of William's death here, because they will be vast, and I'll have plenty of time to dig into them in the future. So for now, I'll say that William's death was just as much a blow to John the Fearless as John of Touraine's was politically, and was a major blow personally. The Burgundian-Bavarian dynastic union, which had served the Duke of Burgundy, his brothers and his brothers-in-law, so well over the past decade and a bit, was now dead. Anthony of Brabant, Philip of Navarre, and William of Bavaria were no more, and now their lands were ruled by children. Vultures were swirling above, hoping to snatch land and power from their heirs, and John now found himself without some of his strongest allies. We've seen that Anthony of Burgundy and William of Bavaria didn't simply comply to John the Fearless's will, but they did generally see their fortunes as connected with his, and for many years the alliance, first sealed in Le Quesnoy in 1405, served all of them quite well, both in Paris and in the Low Countries. They were capable political operators, and the Burgundian party was weaker for having lost them. While the partnerships created by the 1385 double wedding in Cambrai are now over, the legacy of the extended Burgundian-Bavarian clan will continue. So next episode, we'll see the Civil War continue to rage on as John faces off against the Armagnacs without his best allies. But ever resourceful, the Duke of Burgundy will turn to the people of France in another attempt to return to power. Thank you so much to my patrons. I'm happy to announce that once again we have a new patron to thank, Quentin, Graf von Blossfeld. And also, Christine, Comte de Chenonceau, Elliot, Graf von Gravenstein, Anthony, Comte de Châteauneuf-en-Auxois, James, Graf von Temse, Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau, Mark, Comte de Meursault, Diana, Graf von Beersel, Mehmet, Comte Santerre, Chris, Comte de Seymour, David, Graf von Bornum, Rosa, Comte de Germont, and Elliot, Comte de Bussy-le-Grand. And to my Knights of the Duchy. If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/ValoisBurgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me at Valois Burgundy on Twitter or Blue Sky, or find Grand Dukes of the West on Facebook. You can also email me at granddukesofthewest@gmail.com and check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at granddukesofthewest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.